Okay, now the next thing we want to build is the logic to run our timer. And just a quick demonstration again, when we click on the start button, we'll go into a new page that has a countdown clock, which is based on what we have defined in the dashboard. We can pause the timer, or resume the timer, or stop the timer. Alright, without further ado, let's dive into the code. Okay, first thing first, let's create the timer page. I'll go ahead and create a new folder in our pages directory called timer, and also a start component inside it. Next, we will register this component inside our public routes.js and add another route to render the start page. Now notice that I'm keeping my files and folder structure the same as our routes path. This will keep our files and folders organized and help us to easily maintain and debug our code. Alright, next, we will go to our timer dashboard and modify the start button so that we're redirected to the start page when we click on it. We can do so by wrapping the button around with a link component. Alright, let's test our code. We will go to our browser. If I click on the start button, we are redirected to the start page, where at the moment there's nothing in it. So far, so good. Okay, let's go to our start page now and we'll build the component. First thing first, let's load our layout, and we know that this page has mainly two components, a preview and also the base timer. We have created the base timer component in a previous episode, but we haven't done anything with the preview component. Let's quickly build it now. We will create a new file inside our timer folder, and I'll call it previewtimer.jsx. And we'll load the component inside our start page. And now this component is really just a dumb component that will show two information. First, the upcoming timer object's title, and second, the upcoming timer's duration. Since we're showing the timer's information, we'll get this component to take in a timer prop, which is basically the timer object. And now just for demonstration, we'll quickly pass a timer prop to this component inside our start page. So we'll load our first timer object from our timer store and pass it to the preview timer component. And now let's open our browser and start building the preview timer component. So for the timer title, we'll create an h1 element. We will increase the size, give it a gray color, and also reduce the opacity to 80%. And now I would like to show the up next label before the title. So let's create a span element, which has a smaller size compared to the actual title. For the duration, we'll have a p tag, and we'll give it a gray color, opacity, and also a smaller font size compared to the title. Alright, looking good. We'll also give the whole component a little bit of padding and margin bottom to maintain social distancing from the elements around it so it won't get COVID-19. Okay, let's go back to our timer page, and the next thing we want to do is to put in the countdown clock. In the previous episode, we have already built a base timer component, so let's just add it in here. And just a quick recap, the base timer component accepts a few props. We will put in the timeout and the title property, and just for testing purposes, I'll be using the first timer in our store, just to render the component correctly. We should also pass the onStart, onFinish, and onStop hook function so it can do something whenever this event happens. So basically, when a countdown has expired, we want to move on to the next timer object. So that means in the onFinish hook, we need to change the current timer into the next timer that was listed inside the preview timer component. And this means that we need to have a way to keep track of our current timer index so we know that which timer to run next. And within the onFinish hook, when there's no timer left, then we should stop the countdown clock. A way to keep track of the timer index is to create a new state in our timer store where I'll set the default value to be 0. And now back inside our start page, we can easily get our current timer by using the current timer index. We will quickly refactor our DOM so that we're using the current timer object rather than hardcoding to be the first item in our timers array. And now in the onFinish hook, for us to move on to the next timer, we simply need to add the current timer index state in our store by 1. And to do that, we need to define a new action in our reducer and add a new case inside the timer reducer function. And now back to our start page. To move the current timer to the next timer, we simply need to call our new action by using our dispatcher function, and the payload will be the current timer index plus 1. However, we're not done yet. We still need to handle the situation where the current timer is the last timer in the array. So that means we need a mechanism here to check whether we are at the end of the array or not. It is pretty simple. We just need to check if the current timer index is equal to the total timer length minus 1. And we should only move on to the next timer when we are not at the end. Now when we have arrived in the last position in a timer array, we gotta do another check here. That is to check whether the user has turned on the isInfinite option. If yes, then we want to reset the current index to 0 and repeat the whole cycle again. If not, we also want to reset the current index back to 0 because the user might manually click on the start button in the dashboard, and we also do want to put a stop to the loop. Now, one of the ways to control the loop is to have a local state here, and I'll call it hasStop. This hasStop state will control whether we want to stop the whole timer cycle and to redirect the user back to the home page or not. So back inside our onFinish function, we will run a check. If the user did not want the timer indefinitely, then we want to set hasStop to true. And since we're going to reset the index back to 0 anyway, so we can simply call the dispatcher function at the very end, and I'll set the payload to 0 this time. And now let's go down and refactor the DOM based on our hasStop state. We only want to show the preview timer and the base timer when hasState is false. If the timer is stopped already, then we want to show a message telling the user that we are done and have a link to redirect the user back to the dashboard. Let's test our code. And oh dear, we've got an error. It says that we cannot update the global store while we're re-rendering the base timer. This is likely because we're trying to do two things at once. There are mainly two issues here. Now the onFinish function was actually triggered by the base timer component. And within the onFinish function, we are trying to update the current index of the timer in the global store, which then will affect the DOM. So the problem is our onFinish function has yet to complete, and we are already rendering a new base timer component. This is not acceptable, and therefore React is complaining about it. How can we resolve this? Well, we could delegate the onFinish function's logic into the event loop in JavaScript by using the setTimeout function. So now the onFinish function is actually running in the event loop rather than by the base timer component. What that means is we can now safely run our onFinish function without worrying about the DOM node. Now the second issue is React may not render our base timer component correctly because we did not provide it a key. So based on our logic, whenever we change the current timer index, we want to have a new base timer component, and we need React to re-render that part of the DOM for us. To make sure React does the job for us properly, we should provide our base timer component a key prop. So this is saying whenever the current timer index state has changed, then we want to re-render our base timer component. Okay, now let's test our code for one more time. We will go back to the dashboard, click on the start button, and it is now all working without a single complaint. Beautiful. Let's also quickly style our components while we're here. We will just center the item in the middle of the page. Okay, looking good. Now there's still a few other issues that we need to address before we end the lesson. First of all, our preview timer is currently not okay. The timer that we insert into our preview timer is the current timer. That is not correct. Let's create a new helper function and I'll call it next timer. So this helper function will simply resolve the next timer for us. Within the function, we got to run a check to determine whether we are at the last item or not. If we are, then we should return the first timer when the isInfinite option is turned on. Otherwise, we'll just return none. If we are not at the last item, then we'll simply move on to the next timer. Once we're done, we can simply create a new variable called preview timer to load the next timer and pass this variable to our preview timer component. And just for the sake of testing, I am going to add a new timer in our timer store. And now, as you can see, we are now seeing the correct preview timer. And let's quickly click on the start button to test our code. Once the countdown expires, we are seeing rest instead of workout now. Beautiful. The thing is, the countdown clock does not trigger automatically by itself. Let's fix that. We simply need to pass the autoplay option into our base timer component. Okay, now let's go back to the dashboard and we'll click on the start button. However, we've got a weird issue here. You can see that the countdown clock isn't working just right. Now the reason is because we currently have strict mode turned on in our React app, and our base timer has a use effect that triggers the timer automatically when the component is mounted, and strict mode will trigger it twice. Therefore, the setInterval function that was used behind the scene was called for 2 times, and hence our timer was decremented by 2 seconds for every second passed. To resolve this, we simply need to turn off strict mode back inside our main.jsx file. Alright. And now the issue is gone. However, when we click on the stop button, we do want to show the all done message. We'll go back to our start page. When the onStopHook function is called, we simply need to set the hasStop state to true and reset the current index back to 0. Let's test our code. So now, if we click on the stop button, we are greeted by the all done message, and if we click on the back button, we're back to the dashboard. And one last thing before we end the lesson, in the onStart function, we should set the hasStop state to false, even though technically we're not using this onStart function, but there's no harm for us to leave it there. Also, there's a chance that our preview timer could be null, so we should do a check before we render the preview timer component. Alright, that's it. That's basically our timer app. We still have one more element to incorporate into our timer app, which are the sound effect when the countdown expires or we're transition into a new timer. We'll continue in the next lesson. If you would like to see more content, consider supporting us by becoming a member at my website, Acadea.io. It is similar to Patreon, but in return, you get a lot of premium tutorials and lessons. If you can't become a member, that's totally fine. We are just happy that you are here. We spend a lot of time and energy to produce high-quality videos for you. Feel free to check out our other videos on YouTube, and if you can leave a thumbs up, you will really make my day. If you subscribe, I would jump for joy, and I'll make more videos for you. Thanks for your support, and I'll see you next time.